Good morning.
Good morning.
If you're new to the society, today's exercise might be a bit mysterious. This musical Sunday is part of a tradition here that goes back many years of an occasional larger musical presentation in place of a sermon. The premise is that music making, among its many roles in today's culture, can still be a spiritual exercise in itself. And there's that word, spiritual, that we encounter so often these days that calls to mind so much and sometimes too little that both explains and confuses. What's spiritual about music? What's spiritual about anything, for that matter? What does it have to do with religion or this place? What special attribute or connection to our lives must some pursuit or belief exhibit for you or me to call it spiritual? A fascinating video I watched last week on the New York Times website offered a glimpse into the life of a principal dancer for the Alvin Ailey Company. It began with scenes of her stretching and warming up with her voiceover. For me, dance is life. It is where I find my highest spiritual self. It's my faith, my religion. I know exactly what she meant, for as a musician, and I suspect many musicians, feel exactly the same way about our profession. But is dancing or music making a religion? No. Does it have, for her and many dancers and musicians and writers and painters and artists of all sorts, a spiritual dimension? For sure. Does calling something spiritual make it so? I don't think so. I'm sure you would find many folks who, perhaps until relatively recently, would declare that their spiritual core had to do with New England Patriots. No offense, but I think we can all do better than that. The impetus for these thoughts was reading an article in last summer's issue of the magazine New You World. The author is Doug Mooder, a resident of Nashua, New Hampshire, and an online columnist. His title is Beyond Words, The Spirituality of Humanism. After offering his own take on what I'll call the spirituality danger zone, he cuts to the chase and offers his own definition. He writes, "Spirituality is an awareness of the gap between what you can experience and what you can describe." Spirituality is an awareness of the gap between what you can experience and what you can describe. Mr. Mooder goes on, "The first thing to notice about my definition is that it is humanistic. It's about people seeking a kind of awareness and does not necessarily require any gods or souls or spirits or afterlives. Second, by defining spirituality as an awareness, I've placed it on the subjective side of things. Nothing is spiritual in and of itself. It can only be spiritual to somebody. So spirituality is not a place like Shangri-La or Brigadoon where other people can go, but for some reason they can't tell you where it is. And it's also not an activity like meditation or praying or chanting. Whatever activities raise your awareness of the gap between experience and description are spiritual for you, and not necessarily for anyone else." This resonates well for me. I like the humanistic angle too. I think after years of learning notes and practicing and going through the rigors of performance and the inevitable frustrations and feelings of inadequacy in the face of great art, but also years of musical delights of discovery and even revelation, I'm more and more comfortable taking the long view. The experience of music making or appreciating or reading great literature or making or taking in great art is an exercise in finding our humanity. I've read that the late Benjamin DeMott, a longtime Amherst professor, wrote that English class is, quote, "the place wherein the chief matters of concern are the particulars of humanness." In a documentary on the beloved Juilliard piano teacher Rosina Levine, her one-time student Yong Il Han says, "She was a teacher in the truest sense. She made you understand that music is just an outlet through which the human quality is taught." A mentor of mine when I was a graduate student in New York City, after an evening of playing chamber music at his home, turned to me and said, "This is the best we've got." I'm not sure I quite got the gist of it at that time. I have now, though, many times over. In his discussion of what he calls the gap between what you can experience and what you can describe, Doug Mooder does in fact cite that sentence of Aldous Huxley, "After silence, that which comes nearest to expressing the inexpressible is music." Huxley is by no means the first to point this out. One of my favorite passages in all the literature about music making comes from a letter written by the Romantic composer Felix Mendelssohn in response to a correspondent who complained about the vagueness of musical meanings. In 1842, Mendelssohn responded this way: "People often complain that music is too ambiguous, that what they should think when they hear it is so unclear, whereas everyone understands words. With me it is exactly the reverse. The thoughts which are expressed to me by music that I love are not too indefinite to be put into words, but on the contrary, too definite." In fact, in his essay, Huxley dwells not so much on composing sounds as on writing words. His conclusion, what you can't convey in words, you might just be able to express in music, or perhaps in silence. The musical sounds you're about to hear come from the pen of the Czech composer Antonín, or Anton, as the children's story had it, Dvorak, who composed his piano quintet in 1887. You've heard the third movement as the interlude. The second movement is long and melancholy, and we don't have time to play it now. The first and last movements are sunny and expansive. The work as a whole is one of the most beloved in the chamber literature. Written by, as the late violinist and Smith College professor Philip Nagley once wrote in a delightful program note, one of the very few composers who seems to have been well-adjusted. What makes it so good? Well, words can't describe. But I can point out two things. It has great tunes. Dvorak often referred in his compositions to the musical sounds and forms of his native Bohemia, just as does his 20th century successor Bohuslav Martinu in his own piano quintet. Every melody in Dvorak's quintet is newly composed, but many sound like the kinds of tunes people might have whistled or sung in the countryside. The one that opens the piece, sung by the cello, is a good example. One commentator calls it that creamy cello melody. Dvorak's quintet also has great textures. Listen to the inner voices in the music, not the ones lurking inside your head. Notice how beneath those lovely melodies another instrument might be playing an equally catchy phrase, or perhaps playing triplets when the others are playing duplets. Dvorak knows how to manipulate musical forms as well as the next guy, such as Brahms, his early supporter and benefactor. But what especially sets his music apart here is its interweaving of musical elements. And so on to the music.